So morning, everyone who's coming in. We're just going to give a couple of minutes for everyone to sort of sign in and stuff. But if you just pop in the chat sort of who you are and sort of where you're coming from, and then in a couple of minutes, we'll get started. And as well with the chat as well, if you set it to all panelists and attendees, anyone who's dialed into anything that Homeless Link have done will know Rick Henderson loves that phrase. So I'm going to do my best Rick Henderson impression by saying all panelists and attendees. Thank you. So again, we'll just give it another minute or two and then we'll get started. But for people just coming in, if you set your chat to all panelists and attendees, and then just put in there sort of who you are and where you're joining us from today. I can see that we've got people coming in from all over and loads of people sort of signing in and joining us, which is absolutely brilliant. Considering it's, for those of us in England, it's one of the last days we can get outside for a while. So thank you for joining us rather than being outside. Cool, brilliant. I'm going to make a start, and obviously people will be joining us throughout, but it's great to see that we've got so many people joining us this morning. So I'm Joe, and I'm from Frontline Network. And for those of you who know us, I apologize. I'm just going to give a little spiel. For those of you who don't, what we do at Frontline Network, we work across the 4 nations of the UK, so England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And our sort of major focus of what we do is working with sort of frontline staff in particular to help support them to be best sort of carry out the roles that everyone does. A lot of that kind of focuses on staff well-being, but other stuff focuses on stuff like this, putting on things for staff, whether that's training, whether that's webinars, whether that's kind of networking and get-together sessions. And what we're doing today is the first session that we're doing in November over Housing First. So we've got a series of events coming up over the coming weeks that are just looking at different aspects of Housing First. It's an absolutely massive topic area, as I'm sure everyone can appreciate, and we're only touching on a couple of little bits about it. But it's something which is being spoken about a lot, especially as a sort of way out of COVID and providing housing and support for people. So today it's sort of the first session on that, and we're going to have speakers from every nation of the UK, which is absolutely brilliant. So we'll have Alex Smith from Homeless Link in England, Ewan Aitken from Ceruleans in Scotland, Deirdre Canavan from DePaul in Northern Ireland, and then we'll have Alex Osmond from Comorth in Wales. Use the chat function throughout. If you've not set it to all panelists and attendees, please do so then everybody can see what you're posting. We've got the Q&A function as well. So if you post in that, we can see any questions that are coming up, and we'll try and ask some of those to the panelists as we go through. We're also recording this, and we'll put this on our website afterwards, and I can email people to let them know when that's up as well. So if you want to look back at this, or if you've got colleagues that haven't been able to make it, we can put that up for everyone to see. I just want to start by launching a couple of polls just so I can sort of see where everyone's coming from. So I'm just going to launch this first one. So I just want to see where in the UK everyone's coming in from today. Cool. I'm just going to end that and share that out. So yeah, most people from England. I don't think that's surprising. Only one person from Scotland. What's happening in Scotland today that's so popular? I don't know. But
they must have heard I was speaking.
Yeah, they've run away. You've put them off. or have you got some sunny weather in Scotland and everyone's gone, let's go get the sun? Maybe that's what's happened as well. A few people from Northern Ireland and people from Wales as well. That's absolutely brilliant to see that we've got people coming in from everywhere. And just the second one I just want to see is just what sector do people work in? Are you in statutory services, public services, or voluntary and charity? Cool. And if we just share that. Yeah, good to see that again, that there's a bit of a mix there. I don't think it's surprising that most people here from the voluntary and charity sector, a few people from statutory sector and public sector as well. I think it's good that we've got that spread because obviously Housing First works with loads of different people. So that's really good to see. So thank you for doing that. I haven't got anything else, so I'm going to be quiet now and hand over to our first panelist, which is Alex Smith from Homeless Link. Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. I'm going to just share my screen just with a few slides. Hopefully everybody can see that okay. So welcome everyone, really good to see such a good turnout. My name is Alex Smith. I'm project manager with the Housing First England project with Homeless Link. I might have met some of you through some of the practice forums that we offer in England. I've been kind of sharing this event. I'm really excited to be part of it. As Joe said, this is the first session and there's lots more kind of exciting content to come over the next few weeks. So this morning I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we developed the Housing First England principles. And just thought I'd start with a little bit of an introduction about Homeless Link. I think we've got quite a mix of people on the Zoom today, so you might not be familiar with Homeless Link and the organisation that I work with. So we're a national membership charity. We have over 800 members across the public, voluntary and statutory sector, and we're really working for that ultimate goal of ending homelessness, and Housing First is one part of the work that we do and the project that I work on. And Housing First in England, the Housing First England project was started in 2015, and the reason that we set this up, I think there were a number of Housing First services starting from around 2010. I think we had the first project in England, and we wanted to make sure that we were supporting that scaling up of Housing First across England. And the project was really set up there to make sure that Housing First was available and viable to everyone that needs it. And we do that in 3 ways. So we support service development, and that's mainly the work that I lead on, is around practice development, sharing good practice. I think there's a link to the Housing First England website down in the bottom left hand corner of the slide there, so www.hfe.homeless.org.uk, and we've got lots and lots of resources on the website that will be useful to both providers of Housing First services, but also housing associations, local authorities, commissioners, a whole raft of different resources to really support the scaling up of Housing First. We're a team of 5 in Housing First England, so there's myself and Joe who leads on the project management, and then we've also got a research manager, a policy manager and a communications manager that are involved, and that is absolutely kind of the second part of the work that we do, is really about influencing policy and decision making and thinking about some of the systemic barriers that come up to the scaling up of Housing First, such as supply of housing, long-term funding, that kind of thing. And also increasing understanding and evidence. So that's the research side. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the research that might be of interest. So in 2017, we had the first picture of Housing First in England piece of research. And this graph just really shows kind of how things developed in England over the past. This is the 8-year kind of up until the point of that last survey, and we've just finished the first round of data collection for the picture of Housing First in England from 2020. So we'll be hopefully publishing the latest figures around Housing First activity in England at the end of this year. I think, as you can see, there was kind of a big spike in 2017, which was a lot to do with Rough Sleeper Initiative funding, and also the MHCLG pilots that we have in England. So we've got 3 big pilot areas looking at the scaling up of Housing First, and they're based in the West Midlands Combined Authority, Greater Manchester and Liverpool Combined Authority. So that's covering 24 local authority areas and is really kind of looking at Housing First at scale. So what is Housing First? I think there are a range of people on the Zoom meeting today. Some of you might be very familiar with the model, and this might be something new and you've come along to hear a little bit about what the model is. So these are just a couple of kind of I guess images really to explain kind of what's different about Housing First. So I think in that first kind of the image to the far left of the screen, that traditional support, we often describe that as a staircase model of support. So there's this idea that somebody who is rough sleeping kind of has to almost go through a series of steps in order to progress to the point of independent housing. So they've got to prove themselves in a way that there are conditions that need to be met and that they move through the system almost at that kind of that staircase that way. It, as we know, doesn't work particularly well for people that have multiple and complex needs, and they often find themselves kind of coming back down that staircase and never quite progressing to the point of independent housing. Housing First is different in that we are moving people directly into independent permanent housing. It's long-term housing, it's their tenancy, it is for people with the most complex needs, and there are, in England, 7 key principles that I'm going to talk through. The other thing is around the caseload numbers, so it is very intensive support. So where traditional support services, you might have quite large caseloads of, you know, up of 20 people. We've got a recommendation, certainly in England, that caseloads are small and the recommended number is 5 to 7. I think I always talk about what Housing First is, and then I think the other side of that is what Housing First isn't, and it isn't a solution for everyone. So in Housing First England, we want Housing First to be available to everybody who needs it, but that isn't to say that everybody who is homeless requires Housing First. It is a very intensive support model, and it isn't necessary that everybody has that level of intensity. It doesn't expect people to cope alone, so it isn't putting people into a tenancy and then just letting them get on with it. I think the name Housing First is often a bit misleading because it suggests that housing is the most important part, where really housing is a really important part, and you know, people absolutely do need somewhere safe, secure and appropriate to live, but the most important thing with Housing First is the support that then comes along with that. Yeah, so I think I'll just, hopefully other people will be talking a little bit more about the model as well, so, and we'll have time for questions. So if there is anybody who wants more information about the model itself, then we can either discuss that in the Q&A, or I'm happy if people want to contact me outside of this. So yeah, so a consistent approach is really where we started from with the development of the 7 principles in England. We wanted to avoid confusion over the Housing First model and make sure that it wasn't conflated with other kinds of, you know, floating support, or it could be seen as a cheap version to support people with complex needs. We wanted to make sure that there was a real, I guess, adherence to, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about fidelity as well, but I think this idea that we've got a set of principles, a set of ways of working that really guide the model, that we can say that this is kind of the gold standard that we're working toward, and we want to try and avoid you know, bad practices that are maybe not in keeping with those principles. And we wanted to create strong evidence for Housing First in the UK. I think, like a lot of models that come from other places, so Housing First originated in the US, and the context is very different there, and the way that, you know, you access housing, the welfare system, everything looks quite different, and especially around kind of support models about having integrated teams around mental health and substance misuse. So looking at Housing First in the UK was really important, and thinking about what we need to adjust or adapt to make it suitable for our context. And in developing the principles, this took quite a long time in England, so over 2 years. It was a real collaborative approach. So as you saw in the graph a little earlier, there were a number of Housing First services that had come into being between 2010 and 2015, and we consulted very collaboratively with them around the principles and developing the principles. So that was done with the existing Housing First services in England at the time. We also had strong links with colleagues internationally, so Sam Sombreras was heavily involved in the development of the 7 principles for England, and thinking about how and why they were different to the principles that have been developed in the US. And they were launched in 2016, and again, kind of looking at the website is changed on this slide, which isn't very helpful. This is what you get for copying and pasting on slides. But the Housing First England website has a very useful kind of infographic guidance on the principles, and I'm going to talk through the principles, but I just wanted to show this film. So this is a film from colleagues in the southeast. I'm just waiting for it to come up there. So this is 2 saints in the southeast who, just for 5 minutes, kind of, I think, really nicely sum up the 7 principles of Housing First, and also share Sam's story from her experience of being in Housing First. So hopefully, if anyone can give me a thumbs up that this is playing okay, I'm going to play this and hope it works.
Hi, my name's Donna.
My name's Jane.
And we're going to talk to you today about Housing First. Housing First is an evidence-based approach to supporting clients who have a history of entrenched rough sleeping or repeated homelessness. Housing First supports these clients to sustain their own tenancies in the community and long-term assured short-hold tenancies. It has been widely adopted throughout the US. It is in housing strategies across France, Denmark and Finland. It's also becoming very popular within the UK. West Berkshire has adopted Housing First roughly 12 months ago, and Jane will speak about West Berkshire now.
In the past 12 months, we've successfully homed 10 clients through Housing First. In West Berkshire, we implement true Housing First, following the 7 principles outlined by Homeless Link. We think this is crucial to get the right clients into the right property with the right support. The 7 principles are as follows. Number 1, people have the right to a home. Number 2, flexible support is given for as long as it is needed. Number 3, housing and support are separated. Number 4, individuals have choice and control. Number 5, an active engagement approach is used. Number 6, the service is based on people's strengths, goals and aspirations. And number 7, a harm reduction approach is used. The people that we've housed have all experienced difficulties in life. They might have drug or alcohol problems, or mental and physical health needs, or they've been involved in the criminal justice system, or they might just have been entrenched in rough sleeping. All these problems impact on a person's ability to function properly. Slowly and surely, we've watched our clients turn their lives around, and some of their milestones might be simple things like changing their address with their bank, seeing if they can go on script, or for one chap we have, it's just going back to his flat every night and actually sleeping in his own bed.
Although there is an initial cost to implementing Housing First, we have in West Berkshire proven that there is a reduction in services, so hence a reduction in costs. There's been a reduction in blue light services, call-outs such as ambulance, police, fire. There's also been a reduction in physical health needs, such as less fitting. We've also had a reduction with drug use, which has impacted the community, and more engagement with mental health services. So overall, Housing First has saved the community and other services money.
We've had lots of really positive experiences with our clients, including Sam, and this is Sam's story.
Hi, I'm Samantha, and this is my journey for Housing First. My housing journey started last year, April, May. I was living on the street, and then I moved into a caravan. Living in a caravan was not appropriate. I have unconditional epilepsy. I didn't have any cooking facilities. I didn't have any wash facilities. I didn't have any toilet facilities, and that became very difficult. It affected me very, very bad. At first, I was off the street, but then not having any cooking facilities or toilet facilities was very, very difficult. Now I'm out of the caravan and in my own flat, it has made an amazing change. Because I had the flat, I wanted to change myself. It gave me hope. The Housing First provided carpets, and I was allowed to pick the colour. There was a washing machine, a toilet, a fridge, my bed. They took me to a local furniture project, so I needed to change my lifestyle to make this work. Because I've got the flat, I'm happy to stay in, not walking the street, cooking, cleaning, and really enjoying it.
Great. So I'm just going to talk through those 7 principles that Jane mentioned in the film. I'm trying to move my my screen of pictures round so I can see the words on the screen. It's tricky on Zoom, isn't it? Okay, so principle one is that people have a right to a home, that housing is absolutely a human right. The type of housing is very varied in England. So we use typically a combination of private rented sector as well as social housing. But one of the key things is that we prioritise access to housing as soon as possible. There aren't specific timescales, because I think one of the other principles is around choice and control, and it's very much, you know, led by the person, but the housing is accessed as quickly as is possible based on what the person wants, and that there aren't any conditions to accessing that tenancy. You don't have to prove anything in order to access the tenancy. You don't have to stay sober for a specific amount of time, or, you know, not engage in criminal activity. It's very much just based on the fact that you want to be indoors and you want to be in a tenancy. The tenancy is typically in the person's name. So they hold the tenancy. Some services have had to adapt to that a little bit based on their local context, and some services have kind of sublet agreements, but I think one of the key messages is that it isn't a license agreement, that somebody absolutely has some tenancy rights within the accommodation they're moved into. Principle 2 is that flexible support is provided for as long as it's needed. So although it's tricky, I think, in terms of funding, providers of Housing First are committing to providing long-term support for people. So it's not a time-limited intervention like a lot of supported housing projects are, where you can stay for a maximum of 2 years, say. This is, again, directed by the person, and it's based on how long they need that support. One of the crucial things is that support is flexible, in that it isn't it's not restricted in terms of the kind of engagement that can happen. So the person, there's no expectation that the person engages with support, and that the onus of engagement is very much on the service. So we are going to the person, we are being flexible about where we're meeting them and what times we're meeting them. If they don't turn up to appointments, then that's absolutely fine. We'll just keep trying. So as Housing First teams, we see it very much as our responsibility to build that relationship up with the person and offer that flexible support that's really on their terms and that works for them. Principle 3 is that housing and support are separated. So again, this is something I think that really tries to separate Housing First from other kinds of housing and support interventions, where most of the time your housing will be connected to your support in some way. And that means that if your support is if your housing is lost, or if there's an issue with your housing, then that directly impacts on the support that you're receiving, and that is different in Housing First. So if there are issues with your tenancy, even if it comes to the point that you lose your tenancy and you're evicted, that doesn't change the offer of support from the Housing First team. So they will stick with the person through multiple different placements in different housing if that's what's needed. And yeah, so there is that distinction there. So we would normally have in England a provider of the Housing First support, and then a separate provider of housing. That could be a social landlord, it might be private rented sector. There are some services that do both, and it is possible to do both. So as a housing provider, you may also provide the support, but I think the principle still needs to apply. So even if it's not separated in the sense that they're two distinct organisations doing different jobs, there is certainly distinction in terms of the way that that's managed for the individual. Number 4, so principle 4 is that individuals have choice and control, and I think probably one of the trickiest principles, certainly not a very quantifiable principle. It's difficult to say that you are giving people choice and control or you're not giving people choice and control, but where possible, we are trying to empower people. We're not doing to people. We are trying to give them some say over the kind of housing that they have, where that housing is, certainly around the kinds of things that they want to focus on. It may not be that they want to engage with drug and alcohol services, and that is okay. That is absolutely their choice, and we will continue to support them regardless. I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to skip. So principle 5 is an active engagement approach is used, and I think that kind of really links with that flexible support is available for as long as it's needed. In the day-to-day activity within Housing First, that onus of engagement is very much on the Housing First team, and that's where that kind of small caseloads real criteria kind of fits in, because you're not able for a very complex client group to provide the level of intensity if you've got a very big caseload. So I think having small caseloads of a maximum of 7 people really facilitate that very active engagement approach and that ability to be flexible. The services based on people's strengths is principle 6. So where as much as possible, thinking about people's skills, their knowledge, what they can give, rather than the things that they're not good at. And we really try to encourage in England that in the development of a Housing First service that there is a personalisation budget attached to that, so that can really facilitate the 6th principle, and that we're listening to people's goals, their aspirations, the things that they're really interested in outside of all of their support needs and the problems that are going on, and that we can hopefully support people to pursue those things that they're interested in. And the final principle is principle 7, is that a harm reduction approach is used. People are supported holistically. We're taking as much as possible a safety approach rather than a risk approach. So we're doing everything we can to make something work in a safe way, and we're allowing people to make those choices, albeit maybe unwise choices or choices that could potentially be harmful. We're allowing people to do that, but trying to do that in as safe a way as possible, and not restrictive. So they're the 7 principles for Housing First in England. My final slide is just to say that all of those principles are on the website in a downloadable document. And then just last year, we also published Fidelity Guidance. And this is just a kind of a quote on the side there of what fidelity is. I think we talk about this in Housing First a lot, but it's the degree of exactness with which something is copied or reproduced. So when we're talking about fidelity, we're talking about how closely a Housing First service is following those 7 principles. And this guidance is just a really practical kind of operational view of in day-to-day practice, what does high fidelity in each of the principles look like, but also what does low fidelity in each of the principles look like, and how, if we're veering toward those practices, how can we pull that back and think about doing things differently within the service to make sure we're really sticking to the 7 principles. So that's a whistle-stop tour from England. My contact details are on the screen there, so do feel free to get in touch with me if you want any more information. As I say, the website is there with lots of resources on, so please do use that. And Jo, I'll hand back over to you now.
Brilliant. Thanks for Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. I think that was really good as a good sort of intro into how things are being done in England. We had a couple of questions come in, so I'm just going to ask you one or two of them quickly, and then if we've got time at the end, we'll come back to them. So someone asked, sort of, is it difficult to get sort of social and private landlords on board with the Housing First principles?
I think the answer is probably yes overall. I think there's an awful lot of good work going on across England about building those partnerships up with social landlords. It's been a focus for us in Housing First England this year, because that's one of the things that we hear a lot is around the availability of housing and how that kind of hampers really the development of Housing First. So we've got some absolute kind of pioneers in England of housing associations that just absolutely understand the principles, really feel a great sense of kind of social justice, I think, for this client group, and that they've got a role to play, and we're using their voice as strongly as we can to kind of get the message out that actually this is something that works. The evidence is really there that this is a really effective intervention for people with complex needs, and that all of the fears that landlords have around arrears and antisocial behaviour and it just being, you know, not worth the hassle, actually that doesn't come to bear most of the time. You know, the odd occasion there are difficulties, but in working together those things can be worked through and can be resolved. So I think, yeah, it's tricky, but I think it's improving, and I think the more that we can do to kind of, you know, have events like this and invite people in just to hear about what the model actually is, and I think, you know, trying things out. I think just trying to get in there with social landlords and with the private sector as well to talk about the model, to share kind of experiences and to agree, you know, even just a small pilot, you know, just, you know, one or two properties that they can commit to the Housing First service just to see how it works out, is often really effective, just to try and get people bought in, and start to, I think, sell the evidence, but also kind of that hearts and minds argument as well, if actually this is just the right thing to do for a very vulnerable client group.
Yeah, brilliant. Cheers for that, Alex. I'm aware that there's other questions that have come in, but we do have a lot to get through today. So if we can, we'll come to them at the end. And if not, I may be emailing panelists with some follow-up questions to send out, but we'll see.
No problem.
Brilliant. I'm now going to hand over to Ewan. I'll let Ewan probably introduce himself, but he works up for civilians up in Scotland. So for like the one or two Scottish people we do have here, Ewan may be familiar to you, but Ewan, over to you.
Hi, Joe, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this, and good to see everybody here today. As Joe says, I work for Cyrenians. I'm the chief executive, which probably means I'm not the best person to talk about this because I have a bunch of people who actually know what they're doing. But in fact, Housing First has been really close to my heart, and I've been at the heart of how it's been developed over the last few years in Scotland. So hopefully I'll be able to tell you the story. But the story I want to tell you is not just how wonderful it is, although it is amazing, and lives literally have been saved, but actually some of the big challenges we faced, not just in the specifics, but also in the strategy to get it to where we need to get to across Scotland, so it's accessible to all the people that need it. And I was interested by Alex's clear comment was that Housing First isn't for everybody, and that's really the point. It's for a bunch of people who've not had anything, but that's not the same as everybody needs it, and that's one of the interesting things we've had strategically working that out. We've had Housing First in Scotland for about 10 years. An organisation called Turning Point Scotland kind of pioneered things, and they've been running for about 10 years. They've got about 50 people in that group, and they've constantly tried to scale, but the challenge has always been how you get particularly the public authorities on board, trying to evidence the savings against the assumption that it will just bring not savings but a reduction in pressure, and that whole debate about how you bring systemic change when you're trying to use public money to bring about that change when they've got demands to continue to do things as they have before. And I'll return to that point and that challenge about scaling in partnership with the public sector. Then in 2016, along came an organisation called Social Bite, who are essentially social entrepreneurs and social disruptors. And they had a big sleep out, and really began to raise the issue of homelessness through a whole number of ways, and raise some money. Now, I should be clear about that. We're partners with Social Bite. We deliver the Social Bite Village, which is another piece of work that they fund. I have an understanding of the approach they take that has real benefits, but also brings some challenges that they would themselves recognise. But from this big sleep out, they really raised the issue, and decided, having talked to Heriot Watt University and Dr. Suzanne Fitzpatrick's team there, that about what they could use that money to really make a systemic change. Housing First was the one that had the evidence, as Alex said, from other parts of the world that could really make a difference for a bunch of people who'd been forgotten for a long time, who were constantly bypassed by the system, or just simply bounced around the system. What they also managed to do was, through those events, change the political narrative. And to give you a benchmark of that, I talked to a senior politician who said, yeah, the difference is now that there are votes in homelessness. Now, excuse my cynicism, but I'm an ex-politician, or as I like to say, a recovering politician, and I can tell you for a long time that I wanted to do, and I would do stuff to support homeless folk, but that was never something that people said, I'm going to vote for. They just wanted it out of the way. And the conversation had changed as a result of things like the big sleep out and some of the other things that were happening at that time, that meant that it was in a different political thing. It went right up the political agenda, which is really good. And at the heart of the 2017 programme for Scottish Government, there was a commitment to end rough sleeping, to transform temporary accommodation, and to end homelessness that I'd never seen in that form in a huge plan for government. However, there are downsides to that level of political mainstream, and I'll come back to them as well. And it comes back a lot to the points that Alex was making about the business of fidelity and how you hold true to fidelity when you're driving things forward. So out of that programme for government came a thing called the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group, who drew up a series of actions which the government took on board completely. It was a consultation with third sector and public sector. And there was a plan to end homelessness and a commitment of 50 million quid right across the board for that. And in particular, 6.5 million quid from the government to match the money that Social Bite had brought, which meant that you had the leverage to do things in a way to bring about that change, because you have to deliver the new thing while the old thing's running for the change to happen. And that's usually the big problem with trying to bring about the kind of systemic change that Housing First is about when you wanted to do scale. So 2018, a Pathfinder started with Housing First in 6 local authorities, 5 Pathfinders, but one had 2 local authorities. That's Glasgow, Edinburgh, Stirling, Dundee, and Aberdeen Aberdeenshire were in one. That's 6 local authorities out of 32 in Scotland, but that's 35% of the population covered by that. So it was targeted at those areas those urban areas where there was a huge concentration of those in the need for this kind of support. And it was delivered by 5 different consortia, varying in size from 7 to 2. And it had set a target of 850 people being supported and in tenancies over 2.5 years, or over 2 years. To compare that to the 50 that Turning Point had managed to do the previous 10. And the amount of money that was allocated for that was 7,500. It's important to be clear about that money per person. The reason we got to that number was that was the amount of promises of housing we'd had from housing providers divided by the amount of money we had. It was that simple. And that's one of the challenges of bringing in the kind of approach of a social entrepreneur and a disruptor who just challenges to push and push, which is great because you get stuff done that you wouldn't have done otherwise. But sometimes the reality is a bit tough. And that's not a criticism of them at all. It's just that reality is one of the challenges we now face in terms of getting to a target that takes longer than the time we had to achieve it. What was key, however, was a fidelity to the model, and Alex has done a brilliant job in unpacking that. The principles in Scotland are largely the same: assertive outreach with a small caseload of no more than 7, separating housing and support, housing as a human right, harm reduction, support as long as it's needed, choice, and I thought the points that you made were interesting about how choice comes about, but it is that enabling to make all the choices that are possible to make, and also asset-based. So the journey of change that is way beyond the house that is provided comes from the individual themselves, and it comes because of the quality of the relationship that's able to be created between the person journeying with a individual in the house, getting the support, and they discover in themselves that capacity to bring about change. This was supported by national initiatives through a Housing First Academy, connector events, so we were constantly exchanging information about best practice and challenges. And this was all led by Homeless Network Scotland, who play the role that Homeless Link play in England, holding this together. And just published this last week is a consultation on our Housing First framework, which is the articulation of those standards in a way that should be applicable across the country. And this was driven by a non-governmental advisory board, all of which were driven by Homeless Network Scotland. So we had a pathfinder, we have a challenge, we have a target, we have political support, we have a fidelity, we have a model, and we have a support network for the delivery of that model. And that's really great. But what does that actually mean on the streets in ordinary the lives of individuals? And I've got a couple of examples which I have permission to talk about. The names have been changed, but I have the permission of those individuals, which will tell you something about when things go well and when things don't. So they're both from our experience in Cyrene. So the first one is about a guy called Kevin. Names have been changed. A guy called Kevin, who's supported by a key worker called Stephen. And they meet regularly. And so Stephen, Stephen's the person being supported, and he explains that he has stayed in a backpackers hostel after sleeping the night before, even though he has a housing first tenancy, because there was a murder in the common stair the night before, and it brings back memories of his own trauma. A pain that's consuming all his thoughts, and Stephen cannot stand to be in that flat any longer, and just gives the keys back to the housing provider. Even though he was in the tenancy, this was just too painful. And that business of coping with trauma is one of the key reasons for that fidelity of never giving up, of constant assertive outreach, of understanding that those behaviours seem strange ones to be, but actually are the reality for that individual. So Kevin says to Stephen, I'm going to help. They speak to Castle Rock, who tell him that the police, that's the housing provider, police have assessed the property as safe. And Kevin says, ask for flexibility, advocates for Stephen on the grounds of that recurrent trauma, but this isn't accepted, and the housing provider says, no, you've given it up. So they go back to the council, present at the council, but he's told there that he can't be accommodated, his tenancy is complete, which means that that requires 28 days. So that's immediately a systemic way of putting somebody into a difficulty for 28 days because of a trauma they've experienced that they can't deal with. So that's a second rejection. And technically, legally justifiable isn't about the human being and about the person themselves and their needs right at that space. So they ask for space in the hotel that is being used as the night shelter because of COVID. So in Edinburgh, as well as many other places, the night shelter was delivered through a hotel. At this point, they begin at the exit planning, but they agree over the phone a short-term stay in what was the night shelter in the hotel. So they go along, Kevin and Stephen go along, and then they discover, because previously, before Stephen had been on Housing First, there'd been an incident at the night shelter and he had been excluded. He wasn't allowed to be included. He couldn't be brought in. So he couldn't be used in the night shelter. So he's in his third rejection by the system, including by a third sector organisation who do it for understandable reasons, but actually the devastation is even stronger. So eventually we get Kevin gets an opportunity for one of the other hotels that is being used during COVID. But by this time, Stephen is just scunnered with it. He's found a friend to stay on his couch for a few days, and he just says, I've had enough of this. I'm out of here. Too many rejections. However, Kevin doesn't give up. He gets back in touch with Stephen, meets him again, eventually gets him into a local hostel. Over the next 3 or 4 weeks, he just keeps chipping away to make sure that support is remained. It's never changed. He's always there. And now that relationship is in a place where Stephen is thinking about getting back into Housing First, into tenancy, and it's always at Stephen's pace. So assertive outreach and the separation of housing and support, absolutely key. Another example is a man named Jeff. He has an abscess on his heart. He's seen to be probably terminally ill. He uses drugs on a daily basis. And he's been supported by another signing needs worker. So he's not in Housing First when we first come across him. And he's in a tenancy, and we keep contact with him, but that's not the role of that particular worker to do it in the intensive nature of Housing First. He becomes a victim of cuckooing because his flat is taken over by a gang who are selling drugs from his property. He's assaulted, and he goes back to the work he was getting support for. He's in a crisis. Hannah, his worker, submits a referral to Housing First, and he's prioritised because he can't get into the home that he has, but he's got health issues, real issues. He can't live in the streets. He is terminally ill. He's accepted onto Housing First, but struggles with the idea of presenting as homeless, which is an interesting challenge. However, this time, after advocacy with a local authority and a housing provider, accepts that the best course of action is to give another permanent tenancy in a different area of his choice. It was argued that he shouldn't get a tenancy by the authority initially and by the provider, but in fact, it was the counter argument was housing was his right. Whatever the circumstances, housing was his right. It would benefit his health, and he would access to an intensive support. He'd been advised he might have only months to live, but he's still around. Jeff is still around since December 2018. He's enjoying the new tenancy, and there's a real change. In particular, one of the tipping points was control of his own furniture budget. Somehow that was a thing in his head to say, I can actually make the best of the life I still have left to live. He was referred to Housing First, given a worker, and had a tenancy within 2 days. And as a result, he avoided a lot of the damage that waiting and that living in the streets or in temporary housing can bring. Those two stories are two extremes of the things we experience. Sometimes the system works and sometimes it doesn't. What we do is we stick at it all the time. The biggest challenge that we're facing right across all the Pathfind areas is that access to housing. And I would say, and I noticed there's been a question asked about this, the biggest tactical error we made in all our early Pathfinder consortium was not embedding housing providers in the consortium. So the relationship, even though we've got systems and partnerships with all these guys, is still transactional. It's that, well, how will they look after them? Will they be around for long term and so on? Whereas if they were really at the heart of the consortium, the delivery process, they would see it's part of the team, as opposed to being asked by others to look after folk or to provide something that others provide that support for. So I would say that the biggest thing we've learned is about that relationship to housing. Of course, in Edinburgh, we have a particular challenge where, there's a recent study showing that 60% of all new social housing needs to be in Edinburgh because of the pressure on housing in Edinburgh and the cost of housing in Edinburgh. Real challenge. And that's a particular blockage for us. But each of the 5 areas have their own housing challenges. And having housing providers at hearts of this would be, I believe, really important in that in making sense of all this. The other challenge we've got, of course, is that we're nearly ending at the second year of the pathway. The third year is half funded by local authority and half funded by the finance, and it's to be mainstreamed. It's to be mainstreamed after 2.5 years. Even though, particularly because of COVID, the Herrick Watt evaluation to evidence that it will make the difference we know it will make, and I've seen in other places, but we have to contextualize, as the point was rightly made earlier, will not be complete. And as a consequence, we're into that debate again about how is it justifiable to spend the significant upfront costs on Housing First, knowing that we can get the savings later on, but particularly given the challenges we have at the moment. The challenge is, of course, there's a desire for a quick political prize. And that's the greatest problem of getting political backing, is politicians want a quick win. And of course, why do they want a quick win? Because they want to say to you and I, the voters, look what I've done. Because that's the relationship we have with politicians. And that's one of the biggest challenges we face overall, is the pressure on politicians to provide things quickly, when we know that the evidence does take time to show, and the nuances and the understanding of how to build the right process and the right system and the right support and the right relationships does take time. So we're now in the situation with 5 pathfinders going with 5 different commissioning processes, which will be a challenge in itself. Because what the government want to achieve, and I absolutely understand that this is a sign of their commitment to it, is they want all 32 local authorities to be delivering housing first, and they want to be on that space and on that place within the next 2 years. So they want to direct their money now to those other authorities that haven't had money, because the pathfinders had money, so we need to get mainstream so they can get into the place they want. That's an extraordinary prize to be ambitious for, but rushing to it means that sometimes things are going to be in a really difficult place. And the 2 biggest challenges are that, of course, the real power of Housing First is that it draws on a huge number of parts of the public purse: health and criminal justice and addiction and council and all those things together. And to draw those folk in together so they can understand that by collectively supporting this, they can all be able to do their jobs better and achieve the outcomes they want to achieve in their area that they have responsibility for, is huge utility. And that takes time to first bring the evidence, to bring the confidence, to see the outcomes, and to have the time to show that it really works. It's not a one-off. And the danger for all of this is that things become driven entirely by cost, and the thing that will suffer will be the fidelity. We're already seeing conversations where we say, well, you could do that a bit cheaper. Surely you could bump the caseload up to 8 or 9. It won't make that much of a difference. Or isn't this really just a tarted up version of floating housing support? And we're saying, no, you have to stick to the fidelity. But we've got local authorities who are under pressure from government, who want to achieve an ambition, which is a good ambition, to get things done quickly. So they're using old-fashioned procurement methods, and they're not have the time to learn from the pathway to get to where we need to get to, so that they can understand exactly what they should be asking for. So we're in a really interesting place in Scotland. Some incredible things have happened, and some huge changes have been achieved. And I'm hopeful that we'll get to where we need to get to. And the publication of the the Housing First framework just this week for consultation, I think will help, I hope, clarify what it is local authorities are looking for. But it seems to me that we're at a tipping point that could go either way. I mean, what's been achieved in those 2 years is there have been 327 Housing First tenancies. By 31st of March, after 2 years, there's a decent chance we'll be at least halfway to that 850 that was the target in the first instance. 87% are still in their tenancies. Not one person, however, has been evicted from a tenancy. All those folk who've left have either ended because of examples of the one I gave there of Stephen, or because one's ended up in prison from a crime that was committed beforehand, but they still stay on the Housing First programme because that support stays in place. Or we've had a number of deaths and so on and so forth. So the success is huge. The challenge in this place where we've actually got political support is to make sure that political energy goes in the right way and doesn't actually destroy the thing it's trying to achieve. But we're also reminded and heartened and given hope by the fact that, as one person in a Housing First tenancy said to me when I had the privilege of having a conversation with us, quite simply, my life has been saved. And another member of a council staff team said to me, we're not there yet, but my goodness, we're in a much better place than we were before, because we're able to ask questions we never asked before about who was really in front of us. So that's the situation in Scotland. Exciting things and challenging things and scary things and really good things. But I hope that's been helpful in this conversation, where we can learn much more from each other, so that those on the edge in those tough realities can get the support they need so they too can flourish as we'd want to flourish.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Ewan. I think there's a lot of great information that you spoke about, and to hear that there's not been one eviction is absolutely amazing, because I think at the heart of all of this, it's people that we're working with, isn't it? And people that we want to support, and people that we want to succeed and move on and move forward in whatever guise that looks like. And it can take, as you said, it takes various different forms. And just a couple of things that you said, I know you spoke about harm reduction, and I think that's massive. And one of the sessions we've got coming up in a couple of weeks is looking at harm reduction. So for anyone who's interested, that's on the 17th. I'll post it all out afterwards. But harm reduction, we're going to be looking a little bit at sort of harm reduction in Housing First. And I think you mentioned Turning Point as well. I think we've got them speaking as well in a couple of weeks about how do you integrate people long term into community, and once you move someone into a Housing First property, it's not just, you know, 4 walls and a ceiling. What else goes into that to really ensure that things are successful? So that was absolutely brilliant. And as well, recovering politician, I mean, if you want to come back and replace some of the current ones we've got, I'm sure that'll be accepted, because, you know, we don't need to go into that, do we? But
yeah, let's move on. Let's move on.
Brilliant. Cheers for that, Ewan. I'm going to move straight on to Deirdre. Deirdre's from DePaul in Northern Ireland, and I will let Deirdre introduce herself and take it away.
Thanks very much, Joe. And it's absolute. I'm so delighted to have such a platform, I guess, to have speakers on to speak about Housing First, because we're so passionate about it as an organisation ourselves. And, you know, I'm really encouraged, I guess, and comforted by the fact that the successes and the challenges so far that has been spoken about, we're experiencing here in Northern Ireland as well. So, you know, we're all on the same path, and I guess together we can certainly make this a way forward to end homelessness. So I'm going to stop my video so that I can just refer. Thank you. Joe is going to present on my slides for me. Thank you. So DePaul Housing First. So who are DePaul? So I thought I'd start off and just tell you a little bit about who we are. So DePaul is part of an international organisation, and we're cross-border charity here in Ireland, and we have services both north and south of the border. We're helping people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness, and our vision as an organisation is to have a society in which everyone has a place to call home and a stake in their community. And what more speaks to Housing First than that? Housing is a human right, and everybody has a right to a home. Our mission is to end homelessness and change the lives affected, those lives that are affected by it. And again, I think I have to take my hat off to our staff who do exactly as you've said, Ewan. They don't give up. They keep on going back and back, no matter how challenging and difficult the circumstances may be. And to build that trust and relationship with individuals is so very important. We're a values-led organisation, and our values are there for you to see, and Housing First sits very firmly in the heart of all of that. So moving on to what we have done in the last year, DePaul has worked with over 4,800 men, women and children across our 5 main service areas. So we have family and young people services, high support accommodation, health and rehabilitation, housing and prevention, and Housing First sits firmly within our housing pillar. So the history of how did it all begin? So thank you, Joe. So how did it all come about, and how did Housing First start for us? We have a service in Belfast, which is called Stella Maris, and it's a wet hostel for street drinkers. And many believe that individuals who are accommodated in Stella Maris had nowhere else to go, and that basically reached the end of the road, and that there was no hope for those individuals to ever turn their lives around, and certainly not to sustain a tenancy. And we believe differently. As an organisation, we thought that's not the case. We could see the potential in individuals. We wanted to build upon their hopes and dreams and aspirations. And so we approached our funders in the Housing Executive Supporting People, and Supporting People very openly said, absolutely, we're happy to let you redirect some of your existing funding and pilot a Housing First service. And so it began for us in 2013. In 2014, we expanded the service based on the success that we'd had within the pilot. And And we were very optimistic, I'd have to say, in the beginning. We we opened the opportunity for at least 12, maybe 13 people out of the Stella Maris service to acquire a property of their own, and we moved people out quite quickly into their own tenancies. And that was very successful. There were a number of people, obviously it was a big move for them, and they needed the additional support and moved back into the service. But over a period of time, they were able then to use that and move forward. We then were approached by the housing executive to undertake a review, basically, and look at how well has this pilot worked. So there was an evaluation done in 2015, and we published the findings of that. And that really showed at that early stage that there was a real social return on investment, that individuals were sustaining their tenancies, that they were able to reduce maybe the level of substance use, and they were able to engage in community life outside of the normal sort of street activity that we found a lot of individuals that were using Housing First had previously engaged in. So then in 2015, we extended the service to another city in Derry, Londonderry. So it's probably about 140 miles from Belfast. So two main cities in the north, and we opened a Housing First service there as well. So rolling on to 2018, we wanted to assess how we were delivering the service and if it was truly aligned to the principles of the international model. So we undertook a fidelity assessment, and I'll speak a little bit about that just in a few slides forward. And then October 2020, we have received additional funding to expand the service in response to the current pandemic. Now that's only temporary funding and will only take that extension up until March 2021, but we're hopeful that that may be extended. And it's important to say that in these early stages, what we did was we realized, obviously, we can't deliver Housing First on our own. It is a multi-agency approach. It takes a collective response and buy-in from other organizations and agencies. So we set up two groups. We set up an operational steering group, which was going to be those on the ground that were going to be delivering the service, and who were the key partners, and we identified those very early on. We needed key partners like floating support services, criminal justice, policing, health, and housing at the table. And we also set up a strategic oversight group. And again, our ambition at that stage was really around getting that buy-in at a government level and at a strategic level within health, housing, and criminal justice to actually steer, guide, and direct the direction of Housing First in Northern Ireland. So moving forward then, we looked at the 8 key principles. I'm not going to read through them all again because my previous speakers have actually gone through that greatly. But basically we looked at those 8 core principles, and we used those to guide and enable us to set up the model that we felt was most suitable for Northern Ireland. The flexibility of support as a long-term requirement for Housing First is critical, and it's the one area that I'm going to focus on in this without reading through these all again. One of the challenges that we have found is that confusion between Housing First and floating support. Just to go back a bit, Joe, before we move on. We find that a lot of other organisations, statutory and voluntary sectors, had maybe a misconception that this should be a short-term, time-limited type of support, and that is not the principles of Housing First. It's for a very specific, small percentage, really, of the overall homeless population. So it is a long-term support service that is there for as long as the individual requires it. but it also can be scaled up. The levels of support can be scaled up and down depending on the person's need and where they are in their journey. So I think that's really important to highlight, that that's one of the challenges that we have found, and previous speakers have said so as well. So moving on, Joe, we looked at a number of models, and we took real consideration as to what did we think was the most appropriate model that would work in a Northern Ireland context. So we considered, obviously, the staircase model, where individuals basically move through supported accommodation, and then when they're housing ready, they move into their own tenancies. But we actually adopted a case management approach, and that was based on our own knowledge and experience of working with very complex individuals that had long histories of entrenched either street activity or alcohol or substance use. So we felt that this case coordinated model would be the most appropriate. It gives service users immediate access to housing. And as said before, I mean, housing is a basic human right. The engagement with treatment and services and sobriety was not part of the deal. It was about getting individuals into the most appropriate accommodation for their needs. So upon receiving the referral, this is what happens in our model. Upon receiving a referral from external agencies or directly from individuals, we will do an initial assessment to ensure that the referral is appropriate to Housing First. And that's really critical, that that assessment is done, because if individuals' needs can be met by a service that like a floating support service or an addiction service, and there isn't a requirement for a full wraparound support for that individual, then obviously we'll pass on that referral to a more appropriate service. So that assessment is done first and foremost. And then we meet up with the service user to discuss with them what their needs and requirements are and their willingness to engage in the service. And upon that agreement with the individual, we conduct that initial needs assessment and a safety and wellbeing assessment. And that helps us determine if there is an immediate support required to mitigate any risks and you know, maybe any immediate needs like shelter, like food, and maybe some safeguarding issues. So that's all established initially. And once that's established, then the individual will then be able to discuss what their accommodation needs would be, where they would like to live, what their property type would be that would be most suited to their needs. We found over the passage of time that some individuals may require particular type of housing where they have maybe disabilities or health-related issues that have arisen through the long history of street activity, sleeping rough, and maybe substance use for a very prolonged period of time. So making sure that that matching of a tenancy is right is really critical. And then staff go on to source that appropriate tenancy. And that can take anything between 1 month to 3 months, and sometimes longer in some cases. And we initially look at social housing, but we explore the private rented market as well. In the early days, we relied very heavily on the private rented market, and we built very strong relationships with particular private landlords who really had an insight into, I suppose, the social aspect of homelessness and helping and supporting people. So they were open to actually working with people with complex needs, and were, I suppose, reassured by the fact that their tenant would have this support network behind them to help them sustain that tenancy. But over time, we've found actually that we're moving more and more to social housing, because obviously there is more security in the tenure for those individuals. So once identified, we place the individual into the property, and we provide all of the initial supports while building trust and seeking to understand the needs and the aspirations of those individuals. It's only at that point that we then engage the packages of support, and that's very much led by the service user. So we learned earlier on the importance of not overwhelming individuals by putting a whole raft of multi-agencies and services upon them and thrust all that upon them because we feel it's the right thing to do. It's very much at the service user's pace, and that could take months. It could take a year before you have all of the appropriate services engaged with that individual. So then we agree the support plan, the levels of engagement with the service user and other identified agencies. So for example, addiction services might be visiting the individual once a week, whereas float and support services may be coming in 3 or 4 times a week. And the level of support is scaled up and down. And I think that's one of the things that's really important to focus on, is the fact that it is about their journey. So you'll get individuals who initially they settle in really well, they're doing well, and then they say, oh, I can cope very well, and they want to disengage from all services, and then they hit a crisis point. And it's about being able then to have that consistent approach with the Housing First case coordinator who's built up that trusting relationship, and then can go in and encourage re-engagement in some of the other services. Health can very often, I suppose we can see a deterioration sometimes in individuals' health or substance use, and that communication between ourselves and the other agencies is really critical, because it's about identifying when somebody starts to hit crisis points, and that we can do that early intervention and prevent something from getting to a critical stage again where their tenancy becomes at risk. We also run or chair case conference meetings and interagency meetings where the service users are involved, and they're able to direct, I suppose, the package of support and ask for the adjustments to that to best meet their needs. So that ongoing monitoring and support for the service users in a multi-agency approach is really important. So just to say about the staff model, just when I'm here, this is a very small staffing model. We have only 4.5 staff, frontline staff, and a deputy manager in each of the cities. We're carrying probably a bigger caseload maybe than what's recommended by the international standards. We're working on a basis of about 8 to 1, and sometimes that flexes up and down depending on the complexities of individuals' needs at any given time. So that's something just to keep in mind. It's a very intense level of support by a very small team. So moving on to how people come into the service in Northern Ireland. So our referral sources, there's no central access point, and that's something we feel should be established going forward, albeit it shouldn't be rigid. But we do think that it would ensure that the right people are referred into the service and have access to it. We take referrals from multiple agencies and sources, so you'll see that from the slide: addiction services, prison, probation, and our housing authorities, and many others. But it's important that individuals can refer themselves, because sometimes it's about word of mouth, and people who are engaging in street activity or sleeping rough may actually talk to some of their friends and say, well, you know what, I've been engaged in this Housing First, I've now got a tenancy, and it's done at my own pace. I can buy in or out of the services. I don't have to stop drinking. It's not part of getting a tenancy. You should speak to these people. So that ability for people to self-refer, I think, is really critical. So just moving on to our case management toolkit. So we have an electronic client data management system where we record all of the information in relation to service users' activities. So needs assessment, support plans, key working, all of those things, appointments, referrals to other agencies, and all of that. So that's kept, that information is all logged on by the frontline staff, and it also enables us to log engagement from our other partner organisations, because they're critical to the delivery of the support plan based on the individual's needs. So it's really important that we maintain all of the relevant information. We can set goals with the service user, led by them, as to what it is they want to achieve, and we can measure those milestones for them and show where there's been some progression, where maybe things have dipped a little bit, or where they've reached their baseline, and we understand where that baseline is for those individuals. So that's really important as well. So moving on then to a fidelity assessment. So as I mentioned earlier on, in 2018, we felt it was timely to evaluate where the service was at, and to ensure that we hadn't strayed from the guiding principles of the International Housing First model. And the assessment looked at housing process and structure, how housing and services are related, the service philosophy, the service array, and the team structure and HR. So that was sort of what the assessment looked at. The methodology we used, moving on, Joe, please, was actually we evaluated the service on the pathways in and out of the Housing First programme and the internal assessment survey. So how does it work? What's our training and development like? What's the staff and service users' understanding of it? And so on. And then the service user survey. So how did they feel it was working for them? Because none of these services, or any services that we deliver, is of any use if it is not meeting the needs of the individuals and if they don't feel it's of value to them. So the service user survey was really critical. And then external agency engagement as well. How did external agencies find it? Did they understand it? Was it working well for them? And that threw up some very interesting, I suppose, insight for us, because we found at that stage that the agencies that were directly engaging with us and were working with service users understood that whole case coordination model. But for some other agencies, there was a little bit of confusion. Were we duplicating work that they were doing, and so on? So the understanding of what a Housing First model is really critical. And that's something actually I think we need to look at in a little bit more depth. So what did the fidelity assessment tell us? It told us that it was means tested against a score of 4. And in most areas, the service had actually scored really, really high. You'll see from this that in most areas it was high, but service array and housing process structures scored quite low. And I'll explain that in the findings if we just move on, Joe. Trying to keep to time here, folks. So our key findings was that the service was operating to a high level to the fidelity of the international recognised standards. However, the lack of housing supply really had a considerable impact on capacity for Housing First services. And that's what previous speakers have said as well. Housing supply is really critical. At that time, we looked at data over the 2 years because that's the time we had specific data to be able to assess and analyse in its entirety. And we had placed 87 successful placements during that time. 74% of those individuals had sustained their tenancies and that had been worked with over that period of time. The Housing First team had developed strong working relationships with external statutory and community-based services, but they were all done on informal basis. So there was a lack of formal arrangements for the service. So that was very restrictive because it was really just about relationships at a local level as opposed to it being driven from a statutory level. And then the social isolation and the ability for service users to establish roots back into the community was also a prevalent feature of what affected the fidelity of the model. And that was something that we looked at as an organisation as to how could we support people who felt socially isolated and maybe weren't able to connect into a community again when they were housed in their own tenancies. So fast forwarding, and with the passage of time, 2 years on, we're able to reflect back over the 7 years that the service has been working. And this is an outline really of the demographics of the service user groups. So To date, we have accepted 338 referrals across the 2 cities. The average age range, I've broken this down into 18 to 20 and then 20, 30, 40, 50 and 60 plus. And you'll see from this that the 30 plus is the highest age group that's presenting into Housing First. And it'd be interesting to know if that's what people are finding in other parts of the UK, closely followed by those 40 plus. So that's the greatest presenters. While the numbers are greater over the 7 years than they were in the early stages when we did the first evaluation, they have remained consistent in that the highest presenters have been in that 30 plus age bracket, but also they've been predominantly male. And that's quite significant to see that in that data, 261 individuals were male and only 77 were female. So that speaks, I guess, to how we need to be looking at what other support services we need to engage for female presenters to make sure that it's not male dominated and that we're concentrating the support agencies around maybe the requirements for the male population within the Housing First service. So moving on to the tenancy sustainment. So whilst we accepted 344 individuals as referrals, we only placed 253, and I shouldn't say we placed 253 people into their own tenancies. So 73.5% of those referred were actually placed into tenancies. For those that weren't placed into tenancies, the reason for that was that either individuals decided that the service was not for them, or they disengaged very early on. Some people returned to prison, and there were sadly a few individuals that passed away. So there was various reasons why referrals didn't translate into actual tenancies. So you'll see that and these figures they're not a duplication, they're an accumulation, just to say. So the total remained in their tenancies for up to 1 year was 81. The total that have remained in their tenancies for 3+ years was 27. But in total, if we take account of those that were placed into their tenancies, there was 192 of those individuals sustained their tenancy for 1+ year and up to and over 3 years. So that's 75.89%. And I think that's quite significant. So the success rate for individuals sustaining those tenancies, a tenancy and not returning into the cycle of homelessness is evident, I think, within the data. Also to say that of those 192 individuals, sadly 31 also passed away during this time. The majority of individuals, as I said earlier, has been actually placed now in social housing tenancies, and people have moved through multiple tenancies during that journey. They haven't remained just in one tenancy, the first tenancy that they were placed into. Some of the challenges we've faced was the lack of social housing. Sourcing private rented accommodation has been a challenge because very often the tenants need to pay a deposit. So rent deposit schemes is something that has been a bit of a challenge. And sometimes housing benefit that individuals receive doesn't fully meet the rent. We've had referrals made that where clients don't have access to public funds, which is definitely a challenge. And for individuals who are on the common selection waiting list scheme with the Housing Executive acquire points in Northern Ireland. And sometimes if they are or at the beginning when they went into Housing First, they lost those points. That's not the case now. They can sustain those points for up to 12 months. And then if they're very stable within their property, they may choose to come off that waiting list. We had challenges with actually staffing and the complements of staff. Complements of staff has varied, I guess, because we have people who leave. We had a challenge in the early days of recruiting staff because it's a very intense type of support that they're providing to individuals with very complex needs. So training and development of staff has been very critical. Forming partnerships with external agencies, and those interagency agreements has been varied. So we enter into localised agreements with our partner organisations to ensure that the communication in regard to the service user is fluid, and that, you know, important information doesn't fall through the gaps. But getting the Housing First model understood, I think, has been a significant challenge, and that confusion between the Housing First model and other models of support definitely needs to be better understood. The pathways to mental health services and other statutory services are very rigid, and whilst they exist, they're not really suitable for this cohort of individuals. And we need to try and break down those barriers and ensure that pathways are developed that are suitable to meet the needs of these individuals with very complex needs, particularly into mental health services and recovery, addiction recovery services as well. So that's very important. So they were some of the challenges. The service user feedback when we did the Fidelity reports, basically, and I'm not read through it all, but basically they were saying exactly what Ewan had said earlier, is that one particular service user said, I would have been dead if it hadn't been for this service stepping in and supporting me. They stuck with me through thick and thin. There were times individuals engaged well, and there were other times they didn't engage so well, but that consistency and that trusting relationship was really, really important. And it was all driven by what the individual's goals and aspirations were, not by what the staff or the service thought was best for them. So that was really important. So some of the recommendations that came out of the Fidelity report really was that in Northern Ireland, we felt that there was a need for the development of Housing First strategy that tackled chronic homelessness. And I'm really delighted to say that Northern Ireland Housing Executive and the department have actually developed a chronic homelessness strategy in which Housing First and a housing-led approach is part of, which is fantastic. There was a call for further investment into Housing First as part of a homeless solution for chronically homeless people. And that investment hasn't been as forthcoming as we'd like. However, there is definitely, the Minister has acknowledged that housing-led and Housing First needs to be a key part of the government agenda in tackling homelessness going forward. So we're hopeful that that further investment will come in the near future. A regional strategy to develop the Housing First model, the Department of Communities in partnership with the Housing Executive to improve housing supply. And like previous speakers, housing supply is critical to this, because if we don't have the homes, then the Housing First model can't work. So actually being able to identify and set aside housing supply that is specific to the needs of the Housing First model is absolutely critical. The fourth recommendation that came out of the evaluation as well was a strategy and financial commitment towards Housing First from health and social services. And again, housing, health, it needs to go hand in hand, and we need to get further investment from the health department in order to make a Housing First model work successfully. Formal protocols as well is also essential, and that speaks to the pathways into health-related services. So we need those formal protocols agreed. Our local arrangements have worked very successfully. Our informal arrangements, our partner organisations are tremendous, and it's all about what's best for the service user. But we need to have more formalised agreements across our health and statutory services in particular. And the development of methods in which social isolation in the community can be addressed. We did get some funding. We continue to seek pockets of funding so that we can have a community integration worker who works with the individuals engaged in Housing First to help them integrate into the community, to address community issues, neighbourhood issues that can occur, and help individuals engage with what's happening within those communities. One of the things that's very much lacking in Northern Ireland is there's no regional Housing First director to actually drive the further development and rollout of Housing First as a regional approach. Now, we have seen movement within, as I said, government and the department, and particularly the Housing Executive, who are very committed to this. But we need to be able to scale the service up. Housing First doesn't belong to DePaul. It's a model, as everyone has said and recognised, and it's that model that we want to bring forward and scale up in a Northern Ireland context. So that's going to require, we feel, a regional director that can actually direct and lead that forward. It would be remiss of me not to say the impact of COVID and what that has had for Housing First. So social isolation has been a big factor for our Housing First service users in Northern Ireland. We've seen a significant increase in presentations of poor mental health. Addiction in issues has also been very challenging, where people are not maybe getting the access to the normal drugs of choice, and their polysubstance use has become a very prevalent issue. So that social isolation is creating a lot of additional complexities for staff to deal with. We've less face-to-face engagement with individuals, but we have had a reliance on technology, and thankfully, organisationally, we have been able to purchase mobile phones for individuals. We link in with people through telephone wellbeing calls on a daily basis. We're able to link in with them through FaceTime, Hangouts, all sorts of different things, so that we're having that engagement and keeping that trust and relationship strong. And doorstep visits is something that occurs as well. But that in itself is causing, I guess, that remote working for staff who are not coming together as a team physically, but they are linking in virtually. And I think one of the things we have to be mindful is that we keep that staff morale high, because, you know, staff need to be in the right frame of mind themselves to be able to support others. So that's also a bit of a challenge, but we've tried to overcome that with the use of technology. Housing supply, again, you know, is definitely a challenge for us, and you know, we found that we run a scheme in Northern Ireland where no second night out in Belfast, for example, and where organisations are working very hard to get people placed into maybe non-standard accommodation, into B&Bs, into hotels, into apartments. But the wraparound support and services for those individuals is really important. But we have to think about an exit strategy and how those individuals are going to be moved into housing going forward. So there'll be an increased demand for Housing First post-COVID, and there will be a life after COVID, we hope. So that housing supply is definitely critical. But one of the things that it has demonstrated as a housing-led and Housing First approach is the more sustainable option for tackling homelessness going forward. So I think, you know, platforms like this is really important to highlight the importance of taking that housing-led and Housing First approach. There's always a place for supported accommodation, most definitely, but it's about what does the continuum of services look like for homeless individuals. So just to sort of finish, to say that one of the things, just going on to the next slide, please, Joe, was that organisationally we felt that there was a need to ensure that we had resources available to the staff to ensure that they were sticking to the principles of Housing First, to the fidelity of the model, that regardless to the external pressures that they might be, is this a float and support service? Surely this is similar to something else. We needed to ensure that we had resources available to staff. So we developed a resource manual. Just moving on to the principles of that, it was primarily set up to be there as a guide for workers, and it's available on our e-learning platform internally. but also we felt it important that for future partnerships, if we were to get into those, this resource would be used to support and inform for the development of Housing First. And we want to encourage other organisations to get on board and develop out that Housing First approach and Housing First model. In Northern Ireland, there is, or in the Republic of Ireland, we're members of a Housing First Good Practice platform. And that's really, really useful because it's about encouraging and supporting high quality of Housing First practice across a network of organisations committed to establishing and sharing good practice. So that's really important to drive that forward in Northern Ireland as well. We also have a Housing First trainer in DePaul that has done the Housing First Train the Trainer, and they're available to share that training and knowledge with external organisations as well as internally. So that is a very fast whistle-stop tour of where we're at with Housing First in Northern Ireland. We're very keen to scale it up and to get other organisations involved, but the investment at a government level from health, criminal justice and housing is really critical for this service to continue and to develop and to be rolled out across the province.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Deirdre. I think it was really useful to hear how things are playing out in Northern Ireland. We've had a couple of questions and whatever, but we're starting to run short of time. So I'm just going to hand straight over to Alex Osmond from Comorth, who's based in Wales. So over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks to everyone else who's been speaking today. It's been really interesting to get a sense of sort of the common, issues, challenges and development of Housing First across the UK. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to give everyone a fairly quick whistle-stop tour of Housing First in Wales. I'm the Housing First Policy and Practice Coordinator at Comorth Cymru, which is the representative body for homelessness support services in Wales. It's kind of like the Welsh equivalent of Homeless Link. And what I'll be talking about today is the kind of Welsh context, along with the Welsh Government's perspective on Housing First as a model, how we set up a kind of Housing First network with various subgroups looking at different parts of Housing First, the principles that we use here in Wales, which are kind of similar to things we've seen already, but there are some differences, the accreditation process that we've developed and started putting into practice, and again, as we've kind of heard a bit about already, how Housing First and kind of COVID are tied up and what the future looks like, as well as some kind of the key things that I think I've learned from this kind of just slightly over a year that I've been in this role, which have kind of come across strongly to me from my interaction with Housing First. So in terms of who I am, I have experienced rough sleeping and homelessness in South Wales myself. I haven't been supported by Housing First service, although I've certainly received other kinds of support. I've explained what Comorth Cymru does. I've also worked at various other kind of support providers and third sector organisations in housing and homelessness too. So just a couple of points broadly on the Welsh context. Here, we're kind of lucky enough, I guess, to have a fairly even consensus across political parties on the need for Housing First and supporting homelessness support more generally. And we tend to see most parties kind of agreeing that Housing First is a good thing and is the way forward, and along with the context of kind of rapid rehousing. Just in terms of the geography of Wales, I'm sure I hope most people are familiar with the geography of Wales, but we have kind of a smallish number of the kind of denser urban environments and cities and towns in the south, and then there's a kind of there's a lot more rural and small town type environments, up from the middle to the north. And Housing First in kind of small towns and rural areas is something we have kind of less experience with, but we are definitely starting to think about, and we are seeing projects in those areas, which, we're starting to kind of think about the differences between those areas and kind of more urban environments. So that's been interesting. So in terms of the timeline that we've had, let me just move everyone's beautiful faces. In terms of the timeline when it comes to kind of general context of Housing First leading up to the pandemic, In 2017, WG, that's Welsh Government, was kind of open in supporting new approaches to homelessness along with funding for those approaches. So we saw several Housing First projects start then. It was later that year, towards the end of that year, that we kind of agreed to help set up a Housing First network. Quite informally at the start. It's become something slightly different now, and I'll talk about that shortly. But we kind of got involved in setting up that network quite early in Housing First's journey in Wales to kind of try and make sure that, you know, we did stick to the principles, you know, across the country and that kind of thing. In February 2018, so not long after that, Welsh Government's Rough Sleeping Action Plan kind of, you know, officially recognised the effectiveness of Housing First as a model. Slightly later that year, one of the committees published a report that dealt with kind of rough sleeping generally, and one of the recommendations there was Housing First as a default approach to rough sleeping. Later that year again, towards the end of 2018, we had another kind of tranche of funding for Housing First projects in Conwy, Denbighshire, in the north, and then Cardiff, Rhondda Cynon Taf and Merthyr. So again, some quite diverse environments there in terms of kind of their locale. And then in October 2019, a strategy document was published which kind of reiterated the role of Housing First in kind of effectively addressing homelessness and rough sleeping. This was kind of echoed around the same time by the Homelessness Action Group that we'd had set up here, which recommended the kind of rapid rehousing, housing-led spectrum, which of course includes Housing First, again, recommending that as the kind of default approach to people experiencing or at risk of homelessness and rough sleeping. So going back to, I'll pick that timeline up kind of from March a little later on. But in terms of this Housing First network, this group of kind of experts and stakeholders when it comes to Housing First has been really useful in kind of making certain decisions and kind of steering the conversation around the model. So those conversations tend to be fairly strategic. As I said, they're made up of staff from kind of support providers, local and national government, housing associations, social landlords. So this network developed the principles kind of based on Homeless Link's set, but we adapted it a bit, and I'll show you what we use in a second. Certain stances to do with Housing First, one of which I'll mention later on. They were kind of discussed and developed at the network. Various documentation and guidance is published under the kind of name of the network. We get to share updates from projects across Wales, from services across Wales on how Housing First is developing. That obviously includes a lot of discussion of good practice, as well as current issues and challenges. And then kind of underneath that group, we have various subgroups of the network, which deal with sort of specific aspects of Housing First, which is fairly kind of self-evident from the name. So we have the Housing Management subgroup, which is kind of like a forum primarily a forum for social landlords, housing associations to kind of discuss their role in Housing First, and some interesting work has come out of that. We have a charter that social landlords can sign up to that basically affirms their commitment to their role as part of Housing First, and we've had quite a few organisations sign that. Housing First for Youth is a relatively new subgroup, kind of exploring why and how Housing First might be slightly different for young people. The fact that probably does require a different set of principles, which we've been working on. The communications subgroup, which is to do with how we communicate with various stakeholders about Housing First, whether they're kind of part of delivering Housing First or wider, like the general public, elected officials, that kind of thing, politicians and so on. The health and social care subgroup, we've already heard about how health and mental health organisations and representatives are obviously crucial to delivering Housing First, as are various other sectors, and so that subgroup is a way of making sure that providers of Housing First and representatives of the health service are kind of interacting in a way that makes sense, and kind of working towards the same goals, and trying to encourage that to happen strategically rather than because there's someone in a local area who's very passionate and therefore they drive a lot. We kind of want to take that impetus and kind of try and make that work on at a wider scale. And then finally, the newest subgroup, which hasn't even met yet, I must confess, but we're setting it up as we speak, Housing First for Women, which again is going to look at the kind of research around how and why the model might be slightly different for this particular client group. So I'm working closely with Welsh Women's Aid to kind of to set that group up as we speak. And then finally, when the pandemic kind of started, we set up an additional group, the Housing First operational group, which again kind of sits under the network, and that tends to discuss much more practical stuff, particularly in relation to COVID, although that doesn't mean we'll stop that group when we're in the clear, whenever that might be. But again, the discussion there is a lot more operational, and we have kind of support workers who are delivering Housing First on a daily basis, giving us updates, talking about how the pandemic has affected their work, and again sharing good practice and asking other members of the group for input. What we've tried to do with all of these groups is to make sure that they're all safe, open, honest spaces, and we can talk about failures as well as successes, and we can genuinely ask questions we don't know the answers to see if anyone else has experienced certain issues or challenges, and I think that's worked really well. So I won't go through all the principles in detail, but there are 3 that are different from, for example, the homeless link set. So we have the right to a home, the separation of housing and support. We actually specify the group of clients that Housing First works well for in the principles here. So a repeat, someone who demonstrates a repeat pattern of disengagement with hostile accommodation, or individuals accessing rough sleeping at the point when the referral is made. Accessing rough sleeping services, I should have said. Put more simply, it's people who have repeatedly been let down by the system. And that's the audience that Housing First has been proven to work well with. We then go on to have the flexible support provided with no time limits, the active engagement approach, which is key, individuals having choice of control, which again are kind of we've heard about already. The harm reduction approach is vital, and the idea that you're not telling someone to stop using drugs or drinking alcohol in order to kind of have their tenancy as some kind of prize for doing that. That's a key part of Housing First. This is a different one. The service Housing First is delivered in a psychologically informed, trauma-informed, gender-informed way that is sensitive and aware of protected characteristics. In Wales, we've done quite a lot of work on trauma-informed and psychologically informed approaches, and we wanted to make sure that we were making clear that Housing First in Wales should be delivered according to those ideas. Which is obviously, I mean, these are all linked, but that's very close to the next principle, which again we've already heard about, but focusing on people's kind of strengths and goals. These are things that are intrinsically linked to a good psychologically informed approach. We have a reference to an explicit commitment to a small caseload there as well. And then finally, again, we've heard this a lot already, but the fact that we need the widest range of services possible involved. From the beginning, they're key to Housing First. Obviously, we've named health, substance use, mental health, police, but the criminal justice system, prisons and so on, probation officers, job centres, for example. I've heard lots of great stories about, a huge range of services and organisations being vital to delivering Housing First well. So those are the principles we're operating according to in Wales. And basically, we wanted to make sure, as we all do, that Housing First as a model remains strong in Wales, true to those principles as more and more projects are being set up and being established. And of course, when we have a challenge like the pandemic, that becomes more important than ever to make sure that we're sticking to those principles. So we developed an accreditation process, which was what I kind of started working on when I started working at Comorth in August last year, to fulfill this purpose. And basically what that involves is a Housing First specific project will provide documentation to me to evidence sticking to those principles. So policy documents, examples of support plans, all sorts of stuff can evidence principles here. That's then followed up with me primarily, but my colleagues as well, going and interviewing kind of key stakeholders at this Housing First project. I've mentioned key staff members there, but of course we speak to clients too. I've had some great conversations with clients who can talk very thoughtfully about why Housing First is so effective. We then have kind of some recommendations that are made to the Housing First provider, and a final report is then issued, which kind of includes their response to those recommendations, as well as we then eventually have a panel that meets to decide whether or not to award accreditation. In terms of what we've done with that process so far, the Housing First project that operates across 2 counties, Conwy and Denbighshire, in the north of Wales, has been awarded accreditation. The final report in this process is for the support provider and Welsh Government, but what we're finding is that support providers that are awarded accreditation are probably likely to want to share it. So that final report is available on our website. If anyone has any trouble getting hold of that, then obviously just get in touch with me or get in touch with Joe, and I'm sure he'll put you in touch with me. I'm now working on carrying out that process with two other projects kind of simultaneously. They're at slightly different points, but that work is underway. And I'm learning lots of interesting things about how different that process can look, you know, across different projects. And again, the conversations I'm having with staff and clients, both inside the projects, but also working with the projects, have been very thoughtful, very interesting, and a lot of that we're making sure feeds into the wider conversation in Wales that we're having about Housing First. We then have plans for subsequent accreditations running to the end of the financial year, and of course, a bigger part of this process now is also looking at the effects of COVID on Housing First and how people are working to stick to those principles, even in the face of a very challenging circumstance. So kind of building on that, COVID phase 2 and Housing First. Phase 2 is what Welsh Government has been calling the second part of its response to COVID. So we've had phase 1, which is kind of the emergency crisis response. We're now moving into phase 2, which is kind of continuing to make sure that services is delivered well. So some of the key issues, there are lots of them, and again, I'm sure that none of these are hugely surprising to anyone in this virtual room, and I'm sure that you know, we've already heard about some of these. I just wanted to highlight a few of the issues coming up from providers and other stakeholders during the pandemic. Obviously, the balancing of face-to-face contact with clients with the fact that we need to keep people safe. Again, kind of working with clients to make sure lockdown procedures are followed so that we don't kind of have people getting in trouble with their landlords, that kind of thing. Being creative with support when you can't necessarily meet someone face-to-face. The fact that teams are pretty overstretched at this time, although I've heard some more positive stories about recruitment recently. Balancing housing people quickly and properly following client choice. Obviously, the latter is the ideal, and the latter is what Housing First should be about. But in a tricky time like this, perhaps we do want to get people into accommodation while being honest about, you know, making sure that they know they can be honest about the fact that they'd rather live somewhere else when we can do that. And again, that kind of feeds into something I'll be saying shortly. And again, housing supply, which has always been an issue, but has been exacerbated by the pandemic. I've listed some sort of kind of negative stuff there. I do want to emphasise the fact that my overall impression of Housing First in Wales at the moment is that it is ticking along. And in some cases, you know, COVID has actually provided some positive impact, and some clients actually prefer talking on the phone and that kind of thing. So it's not an entirely bleak picture, and things are ticking along well in Wales. So I'm about to show you explain to you that, one of these stances that the Housing First Network decided on the back of the pandemic. Obviously, services have had to adapt how they function and be very flexible in response to this, which led to a lot of conversations about again, we need to make sure that when we call something Housing First, it is Housing First, and that the model remains strong and doesn't get diluted because it's kind of gone through a challenging period. So we had a lot of conversations about that, and basically what we've decided at the network is that if a project softens a principle, has a good reason to do so, and is open about doing so, and has a clear plan to deliver that principle fully as soon as they can, we can still consider that Housing First. So in the example I just gave of trying to get that balance between housing someone quickly and kind of housing someone in the right place, this is where, as long as there is a plan to return to doing that effectively and well, that doesn't necessarily mean a project has kind of abdicated its Housing First status. However, if one of those principles I showed you is abandoned, even with justifiable reasons, then certainly, you know, for the time being, while that principle is not being delivered, we would not consider that Housing First. And again, you know, to some extent, it's about making sure people get the support they need. But with Housing First, it's such a clear model that we do need to make sure that we've kind of clearly thought through that. So just some stuff about phase two, kind of picking up that timeline that I started earlier. So Welsh Government has supported the homelessness sector with £50 million in funding, capital and revenue funding, which is a bit part of a big drive to head towards the rapid rehousing spectrum, which obviously, as I've said, includes Housing First at kind of one end of it. The Homelessness Action Group published another report in March, which reiterated the importance of the Housing First model as part of a wider rapid rehousing push. So currently the Welsh Government is working with local authorities who currently aren't delivering either model, those local authorities that exist that are currently not delivering Housing First or rapid rehousing, and working to help support them to develop those services. And again, we're all invested in ensuring that the expansion of a rapid rehousing approach generally doesn't lead to loss of fidelity for Housing First specifically. This is my last slide. Some of the key things from my perspective, just things I've learned over the last year, but certainly in the last few months. And again, there are lots more of these I could have thought of, but I just wanted to highlight a few, which is, again, as I've kind of alluded to, well-designed projects that are sticking to the principles can definitely endure challenges like COVID and even thrive. Yes, teams might be overstretched, and we need to make sure teams are keeping each other safe and you know, working reflectively and making sure that people's well-being is not put at risk. But I've definitely seen projects go from strength to strength during the pandemic. Having said that, we need to work hard to ensure that the push towards that we don't lose that push towards housing-led approaches, and that we don't kind of see areas sort of using COVID or even in a well-meaning way to kind of regress to models that aren't housing-led or that aren't you know, or focus more on, say, congregate models. You know, developing buy-in to Housing First. I think Deirdre said this. Actually developing understanding and buy-in to what Housing First is, as well as effective relationships between the different people who are needed to deliver it, is still a challenging and vital part of what needs to be done. And it's, you know, it can be done well, but it is difficult. And finally, one thing that I kind of learned to my surprise during some of the accreditation work is that people who are initially suspicious of Housing First, or who take the time to go from not really understanding or believing in it to kind of fully understanding it, can actually be its best advocates and can end up delivering it very well, which I found very interesting. So that's everything from me. So I'm going to stop sharing now. It's great to see so many people here, and thanks to everyone for attending. I'll hand back over to Joe.
Brilliant. Cheers for that, Alex. And I know you had the tough slot of going last, so that's always appreciated. We've unfortunately run out of time. I know there's loads of questions that people want to ask, and so many different places that we can go with these conversations. But I just want to thank both Alex's, Ewan and Deirdre for this, because I think it's really interesting to see how things are playing out across the UK, the similarities that there are, but also the slight differences that there are as well. And I think it's really positive to hear that there is great work happening regardless of the really difficult circumstances we all find ourselves in at the minute, and having to navigate a constantly changing landscape that we don't know when it's going to settle back down, unfortunately. This session is being recorded, and we will put it on our website. And some of the questions, I will email them back out to the panelists and see if we can get some answers. So if you've not been able to have a question answered, keep an eye on your inbox, and we'll try and get something to you in the coming days. And as well, I've just seen someone in the chat say about links about future events. Yes, I can send them in an email as well. So very briefly, because I know people have got places to go. On Thursday, we're having a bit more of a breakout room kind of session, and we're just going to discuss different things about Housing First. So some of the questions where people have asked things, and other people in the chat have been answering them. That's brilliant. And we're going to try and do a bit more of that on Thursday. Next Tuesday, we're doing a session similar to this around multi-agency working. And then on the Thursday, we'll have stuff around community integration, about how do you support people once they're in that accommodation. And then on the 17th, we'll be looking at harm reduction. And on the 19th, we'll be looking at staff wellbeing as well. And the link to our website has just been put in the chat, but frontlinenetwork.org.uk, or just Google that, and it usually one of the first ones that come up. But again, I'd just like to thank everyone for dialing in and thank the panelists, because there were some really, really good presentations by everyone there. So thank you to everyone for coming, and I'll hopefully see you in person sometime next year, because it ain't gonna happen this year. Bye all. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.